at highest clinical risk. And I think as we return to normality, it's really important as a matter of principle that we all get to return to normality and we don't create a situation where those of us who don't have other health conditions or are not frail by virtue of age, for example, have to continue to effectively shield, while those who are not in that position can go about our normal conduct, but those who are have to effectively shield. Let's all continue to do the basic important public health things to keep the country as safe as possible for everybody so that we can all get back to normal as safely as possible.
Well, so you heard that little segment there. It's one of a few clips in this COVID statement. The parts that I didn't cover, obviously, because I went onto the document itself in my stream the other day. But obviously, I did start off my stream watching her statement and then a few of the questions, but then pondered on which direction to take in terms of, do I finish the video or do I go on to deduct the guidance itself? And had I decided at the time to watch the guidance, I would have noticed another pattern has emerged in this statement. I mean, just in this statement alone, there were several different references to the vulnerable. It almost strikes me as it's difficult to decipher whether or not they're being somewhat subtly or subliminally even, indirectly or even directly, who knows, scapegoated. But of course, it's all espoused and implied that they're taking them into consideration. They are top priority numero uno, and they always have been, and they always will be. So, despite the fact they're lifting legal restrictions, etc., for the time being, we obviously all have to change our behaviour. Which was a common theme which started off as a bit of a joke the first maybe hour of the stream or two. Started to become a bit of a boring fucking habit to repeat constantly. Behavioural change, that was the most common thread throughout that guidance that I've seen so far, is behavioural change. They want you to act as if it's still legally required to act in certain ways and behave in certain ways, despite the fact knowing that it's not. And then, of course, you've got to take into consideration the fact that they've got their warning system and etc. So, the guidance isn't going away, the rules ain't going away, they just ain't enshrined in law. And at any moment, at any time, they can suggest that certain areas or the country as a whole consider implementing new rules or rules that are already there, or they might come along again and make them law. Who knows? And when you've got businesses, etc., that have to obviously consider the well-being and the health of their customers, their employees, etc., find it difficult to believe that they are going to just, the minute this is all scrapped and no longer required legally, they're all just going to go back to the way that life was. No, they're not. Of course they're not. Because they're constantly being reminded, even in this stream, this video alone, from Thin Lips to Rhetoric, constantly is, yes, we're lifting legal restrictions, but COVID ain't going anywhere. So, you need to adapt and do what you need to do, etc., etc. So it's kind of like they're testing the water in many respects, to see if the conditioning's worked. Can they lift all legal requirements for you to do what they want and see if you continue to do it of your own accord? And I reckon a good portion of people will. But it's the references to the vulnerable in this instance that really perked my interest, purely because I remember making a video back in 2020. And it was a very well received video, actually, which I've got up in another tab, which I'll play a little bit off. But it was reference and suggestions being made at that point in time, it was around about September 2020, that we should be doing things to, protect the vulnerable, the clinically vulnerable, the ill or whatever, the elderly, the frail, people that are more likely to die or contract a serious variation of the coof in comparison to a perfectly healthy, able-bodied 20-year-old. They should be protected, maybe whether that be via shielding, isolation, etc. Whereas the rest of us would just go about our day, which indirectly would have, it wasn't really suggested per se, because by that point, even the mere talk of herd immunity had been completely castigated and chucked overboard. That was one of the first things they did when this shit first started in 2020. But, by this point, September time, that was long ago that we would ever consider herd immunity. No. So, but that was the underlying implication if we did go down this route. And Nicola Findlays came out and talked about the fact it's unethical. Well, we can't do that. We can't expect the vulnerable to shield while the rest of us go on about our lives. No, we can't do that. They've already had to shield for so long. Yeah, they did. While we also simultaneously had to stay in our fucking houses and abide by rules. You know? And I remember getting so worked up about it at the time because they were at fault. Not the vulnerable. These people that imposed these rules to begin with or signed them off. They were at fault for all this. Because had they allowed able-bodied people like myself to go about our business, while the vulnerable shielded at that present time, or that current time, sorry, then things could have been a hell of a lot different. But instead of that, they forced the vulnerable to shield while telling us that we also had to do the exact same thing in our own homes with the lockdowns, etc. What fucking good is that? What good did that do? Nothing. Nothing good. Nothing positive. But we can disregard that because if they can't take credit for it or look good, then they just don't talk about it, do they? There was no fucking point in making the vulnerable shield while also simultaneously making everybody that could have allowed herd immunity to be achieved to some extent shield as well, effectively. Yeah. Lockdowns, rules, etc, etc. It was stupid at the time, made no fucking sense, locking down perfectly healthy populations, but that's what they did. So then obviously when you come to the September period, as I was referencing there in my video that I made at the time, you know, like, oh, we can't ask them to continue to self-isolate. They've been doing it for so long. Yeah, they have. They've been doing it since the beginning of the so-called pandemic. But at the beginning of the so-called pandemic, you all ruled out herd immunity and made us all locked down. So, what I'm saying is, by September time, they might not even have needed to self-isolate and continue to shield while the rest of us went about our day, because by that point, herd immunity could have potentially have been achieved. But they didn't want to go down that route. Nah, because it was best to lock everybody down. Fast forward a few years fucking later, they're still scapegoating them. Yeah. Oh, fucking unreal. Unreal. But anyway, so there's a few more clips, as I said, and that's kind of why I uploaded that wee video earlier on, actually, because that's where I first picked up on it. So I had to re-skim through it. Sorry, my computer, as per usual, has been really slow. But you know, there's a stream there that I did. I might do another stream at some point in order to finish off the guidance, or I'll do a video form. I'm not sure yet, but fucking I'll do that today. My voice, my throat, it's pretty rough, like. But yeah, this here, shut up you wee dick. There was her, and the only reason I'm not going to berate her too much is because I've watched enough First Minister's questions and COVID briefings to spot her sometimes sitting in the background, and she moves very bizarrely, so I can't tell if she's something wrong with her. But nonetheless, like, I'm starting to lose count now of how many daft fucking comments she's made, framed as a question. You know, there was complaints about vaccine hesitancy at one point. I'm pretty sure in one of these briefings there was complaints about people not wearing face masks in the town centre. You know, there's been some really daft ones from her. And part of me wishes I'd just compiled them at the time, so I had a wee compilation. But as I said, I'm a bit torn because I don't know if she's a bit fucking doolal, yeah. But, you know, whining and moaning about fucking face masks or locked it off in a shop. And then the response from Thin Lips, yeah, it's relatively similar to the first clip that I played. Anyway, so I'll play the clips and then I will conclude what I was getting at, you know.
To be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Douglas Ross refers to personal responsibility, but my supermarket at the weekend, there was more than one group without face coverings. By no stretch of the imagination were they all exempt. So much for their personal responsibility. Will the First Minister then remind us all that wearing face coverings in public places, lateral flow testing, isolation, are not for you, but for others, protecting not only family and friends and work colleagues, but more importantly, people you pass by who you will never know and indeed may be very vulnerable to the virus which you may give them?
First Minister.
I mean, that is possibly the most important point to make as we go into this next phase. Governments can impose legal restrictions that are not proportionate, which is why we are lifting the legal restrictions, but that does not mean the risk of the virus has gone away, and therefore we will continue to encourage voluntary compliance. And the point Christine Graham makes is absolutely correct. We do all these things, whether it's wearing a face covering, get vaccinated, test.
Face masks, face covering, whatever you will. Again, I'm so fucking bored of this almost 3 years on. And still to this day, we still have this thin lip arsehole pretending that face coverings work. She has to, of course, because how else can she have justified enshrining it in law for as long as it was that you had to wear masks everywhere you went? If they don't work, or if they prove to be ineffective, because guess what, they're not medical grade, and we're talking about scarves, snoods, well, that dickhead in the top left wearing bog standard cheap masks, etc. None of these things would ever have been considered effective in reducing the spread of any sort of respiratory illness in the past, but for some strange reason this time around they were all effective. No, they weren't, but in order to justify the law that was implemented at the time, of course they have to pretend that they work. But it just pissed me off. There's just never been any pushback at all. But it's no that part that perked my interest, as I said. So we've already heard about the vulnerable, etc. There's all these references constantly to behavioural change. But you go again, like,
regularly, obviously to protect ourselves, but we also do it to protect others, to protect those around us, and particularly those around us who may, and we may not have knowledge of this, who may be clinically vulnerable.
It's just, I never noticed this, as I said, because I never watched it at the time. But just to keep doing this now, they keep referencing the vulnerable. There's an overemphasis on them at this point, and again, I can't help but feel there's an element of that that's somewhat deliberate. But again, a point I made in the actual stream was the fact that they're highlighting things that have always existed, or were always points that could have been made for any virus or anything at any point at any time, but it just never was. So, for example, they will say things along the lines of, wash down your trolley when you go into a supermarket because, you know, that's imperative that you do that, because if you don't, then the coof could be spread around the supermarket, right? The same could have been said for like the norovirus, which is a prominent virus that can be contracted, especially in supermarkets. You could have made that point then, back in the day, any point in history, to wipe down your supermarket trolley from head to toe or wheel to hand or whatever, because you will help potentially prevent the spread of the norovirus or anybody contracting it. But you didn't do that. But they deliberately highlight the fact that it's with COVID. And now they're doing the same with the vulnerable, because they'll say things along the lines of, you might be absolutely fine and go about your life absolutely fine, but you could pass it on to somebody who could be susceptible to falling quite ill and potentially die. Yeah, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I might sound a bit heartless and distasteful here, but that's fucking life for one. And second of all, that could happen with absolutely anything, because the world is full of germs, absolutely. And people pass on things all the time, handshaking, etc. It's just part of life. Before you know it, there's been a chain, and somebody sadly at the end of said chain will meet their maker, so to speak. But of course, if they're really addressed, it's just sort of something that you would all sort of agree upon if you were asked about it, but it's highlighted deliberately this time around as if this is new. It's not a revelation, it's not new, but it's just now being talked about for the first time. But again, that's not actually the point, the overarching point of this video. I swear to fuck, if I lose my train of thought and the whole point of me making this video doesn't emerge and I don't conclude this correctly, I'm going to lose my fucking shit. But anyway,
and who may be at very serious risk, even with vaccination, of serious illness or death if they get this virus. So doing all of these things is about solidarity, it is about looking out for each other, it's about looking after each other, and that becomes more important as we go into this next phase. So I would encourage everybody to continue to do all the right things for all the right reasons.
Now, obviously, I'm not saying that everybody in Scotland's going to watch this and go, oh yeah, I better change my behaviour and make sure that I change it correctly, because I could pass on COVID to somebody who could be susceptible of dying. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, because the overall, the vast majority, of the publication that I'd covered in my stream, it was behavioural change, behavioural change, behavioural change. Now she keeps repeating over and over and over again, behavioural change, behavioural change, behavioural change. Like, it's littered throughout this. And then she keeps making reference to the fact that there's a vulnerable in society, and we're thinking of the vulnerable, and you could pass it on to the vulnerable if you don't change your behaviour, etc. Yeah, all this shit. So, like, it seems to me more this is not about thinking of their well-being, like they claim it is, and there's an element of scapegoating at play here. If you asked me, because, yeah, God forbid we suggested, if you're that fucking concerned about these individuals, God forbid we suggest that things are put in place to protect them. Oh, no, because this is all about solidarity, we all have to do it together. Yeah, it wouldn't be fair on them. Why wouldn't it be fair on them? Oh, because they've had to do it for so long. And why have they had to do it for so long? Oh, that's right, because you locked us all down along with them, which made no sense to begin with. So again, I'm not, I just, this point keeps being raised, and I just think that it should be rubbished for what it is, because who's at fault for that? Who's at fucking fault for that? You know? And it's not fair on them that they'd have to self-isolate while we went about our lives. Well, that's what would have happened in any other point in history, but for some fucking reason we can't do it this time around. We were never able to, for day dot. But anyway, a few more clips.
I think access to testing continues to be important. It's why we think any of us who test positive should continue to be asked to isolate to reduce the risk for those who are most vulnerable. And we all have to recognise that the desire to get back to normal, understandable though it is, has to be tempered by the understanding that for those at greatest risk, the anxiety is very real. So we can all behave in a way that reduces the risk that people face and hopefully reduce that anxiety. And the Scottish Government will continue to take those...
we all have to behave in a way that reduces anxiety for the vulnerable. You know, we're all in this together. I mean, this is more like scapegoating, if you ask me. As I said, we have to adapt our behaviour to reduce their anxiety. It's very peculiar because they're kind of putting they're framing it now as if, you know, like ordinarily, as I said, things would have been put in place. These things were suggested at the time, but prior to this, it would have been common sense to put things in place, measures in place, to protect the vulnerable in society, whilst the people that were not likely to contract a serious variation and were likely to just brush it off as nothing, next to nothing, they would have all went about their daily lives, and they would have all, in the end, potentially, hopefully, theoretically, hypothetically even, managed to achieve some formulation of herd immunity, allowing then for the vulnerable to then be reintroduced into society. That's common sense, common practice, but that was completely brushed aside almost instantaneously. And as I said, they locked everybody down at the same time, with the vulnerable having to shield, etc., which must have been horrible for the ones in care homes and all the rest of it. Especially, but not limited to all the people, the elderly people, etc., all across the UK that had to do the same thing in their own homes and stuff. But the point is, like, they were going through that ordeal while the rest of us were all locked down. I never understood it at the time, really, and even now in hindsight, especially, it made no sense. But, you know, and who's to suggest that had they allowed all of us to go about our daily lives, the vulnerable could have been back in society in no time. But we'll never know that because they didn't do that, you know. And now we're at this point now where the vulnerable are still vulnerable because herd immunity was never achieved. Far from it, because we were more obsessed in trying to get everybody jib-jabbed. You know, all these years, and as I said in the video from 2020 that I made, all this shit about the vulnerable and all the rest of it, the elderly and the vulnerable, and clinically vulnerable, and yet they were all the people that were dying of it anyway, so all their fucking rules made no difference, did they?
Considerations very much into account as we take decisions in the future about the handling of the pandemic overall.
And Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that the First Minister agrees that everyone should be able to benefit from a return to greater normality and no one should be left behind. And like other MSPs in the Chamber, I have...
No one should be left behind. A United Nations talking point, by the way, but it's just the same shit from 2020. I'm kind of baffled that they're actually repeating it again. But they wouldn't have been left behind. They would have been left behind temporarily in order for us to have achieved some form of herd immunity. You know? So, there's this underlying, you know, telling off, essentially, that people shouldn't get too complacent and go back to the way things used to be, because remember, your behaviour could be the difference maker to the vulnerable in society. And it's like you're being guilt tripped. You have to still apply and abide by fucking rules that don't work, but they have to pretend that they do. And, you know, because there's vulnerable in society. The vulnerable have always been in society. I'm not being heartless or I'm not denigrating these people. What I'm saying is they're focusing on something that's always been a reality. But there was things that could have been done a lot sooner than things that could have been done in general. They were never done to begin with. That could have been done to ensure that the vulnerable weren't as vulnerable. But instead of that, no, didn't do that, did you? Didn't do that. And now we're at a point where you're continuously guilt-tripped anytime it's suggested. It would be unfair, unethical, etc. to ask these people to shield and all the rest of it, well, the rest of us want about our lives. But you could make the argument, flip it on its head and say it was completely unfair and unnecessary to, and you didn't ask, you just forced perfectly healthy, able-bodied people that were never going to, which the virus, quote, quote, never posed a risk to begin with. You forced them all to lockdown, and the only measly excuse that you could ever conjure up in all the time that I have bared witness to this bullshit is that it's about the vulnerable. Oh, okay, right, okay, yeah, okay, pull the fucking other one, like, pull the other one, yeah.
Constituents who previously had to shield or were vulnerable as a result of not being able to get the vaccine, they're feeling a bit scared at the prospect of restrictions being lifted and what that means for their...
Yeah, I wonder why, because herd immunity, as I said, was never achieved. Never achieved. At all. Nothing was ever done that should have been done to make life easier for these people. They could have had their sacrifices at the start by them shielding, self-isolating and doing what needed to be done while the rest of us went about our business. But they didn't do that, and you fast forward to where we are now, and that's all we keep hearing, that we all need to adapt our behaviour because there's vulnerable people in society that are scared of the restrictions easing and stuff like that, and worse to that effect. It would have been common knowledge before the coup was even a talking point. The vulnerable, anytime there was a flu, the flu season came down there, any potential epidemic or pandemic was on the horizon, whether it was just fear porn or whatever it may have been, at any point in time, these people would have known that they would have had to have taken some additional measures in comparison to the rest of the populace. But now, all of a sudden, that responsibility, so to speak, or that point has been taken away from them, and the onus is on us, all of a sudden.
Quality of life. Can I ask the First Minister what further assurances she can give to them that, unlike the approach being taken by the UK government, their well-being is being taken into account as restrictions are relaxed?
First Minister.
Well, further to my last answer, let me just give an assurance again that we are considering, have considered and will continue to consider people at the highest clinical risk in every strand of the phased approach we're taking to managing this pandemic. There are a number of practical ways in which we give life to that. So people at highest risk obviously continue to be prioritised for vaccination. Our testing programme continues to support the effective management of COVID. People who are at a higher clinical risk may also benefit from the new treatments that have been identified, and I set some of that out in my statement. And as I said in my previous answer, we are also continuing to encourage and to recommend to everybody across the country to adopt safe behaviours and practices that help keep those most vulnerable as safe as possible. This, from day one, has been a collective endeavour. We've all had to look out for each other and look after each other, and even as we go into hopefully calmer...
Yeah, it fucking is. This from day one's been a collective endeavour. Not entirely true though, is it? Because the suggestions about herd immunity being achieved were thrown out the window, and the idea of putting the vulnerable or putting measures in place to protect the vulnerable were thrown out the window in favour of us all going into lockdown together as one. So it's not as clear cut as the kumbaya bullshit that Thin Lips is trying to implicate there. Not as clear cut at all. And again, I really can't help but feel that there's an element of scapegoating at play here. We need to adapt our behaviour for the vulnerable. Have you ever heard such fucking nonsense before? And I don't mean that in a disparaging way at all to these people. What I'm saying is that has never been a thing before, but now they're telling you that you need to change your behaviour, which, as I said, is a common theme throughout the entirety of the guidance that they've unveiled. But it's for the vulnerable. It's not for you, because you'll be fine. For the vulnerable. It's a very selfless act, if you ask me. But just these are things that could have been done a long time ago, and if they've been vaccinated, and these vaccinations are as clear-cut and God-fearing as these people claim they are, then what's the fucking issue? But no, they could be jibby-jabby, but they still need you to abide by rules. Fucking wow. What's the point of fucking removing the legal capabilities if you still expect everybody to follow them anyway? I don't get it. I really don't understand what's going on here.
waters of this pandemic, that remains the case. And I would urge everybody, however frustrated you may be about wearing a face covering or having to isolate when you test positive, to continue to do these things because they are about the protection of those who are most vulnerable in our society.
Well, that's the first time I fucking heard that, to be honest, because I never heard that nonsense 6 months ago. Never heard it 4, 5 over Christmas. Never heard it at all. But now all of a sudden they are the #1 priority. It's funny that, almost as I said, screamed out to me as if there was an element of scapegoating at play here. You know, as I said, my video from September 2020, and it was the same shit back then, you know.
What about this idea of enhanced shielding, where those at risk and those people who had to shield earlier on would have to stay indoors and the rest of society becomes more engaged? The First Minister has said that she doesn't feel that is an ethical way to move forward. Is it something in time we may have to consider?
I mean, I would agree with the First Minister, which may not. I don't think that those people that have been shielding for so long should bear the weight and bear the sacrifice for the rest of us.
So because they initially locked everybody down, instead of putting things in place to protect the vulnerable, allowing us to go about our lives and achieving herd immunity, because they locked us all down at the same time, that meant that the vulnerable, who were shielding and whatnot while we were all locked down, were shielding. And then you come out of that period of time, and then the questions then start to emerge again about putting things in place to protect those that had been shielding, while those who have just been spending the duration of their year in lockdowns or under some form of rules go about their lives as normal, in order to then in the future allow for the people that would be shielding to then come back into society after hopefully herd immunity was achieved. And the bullshit we were hearing back in 2020 was, well, that wouldn't be fair because they've already been shielding for so long. Whose fucking fault was that? Theirs. Theirs. And now fast forward to where we are, and we're still being told we need to follow rules that don't work. And of course, why? The reasoning why, the only reason that they seem to conjure up when they can be bothered, is because you might not be affected, but there's a hypothetical vulnerable person out there that might get affected. You know, gone are the days where things were put in place to protect them. Gone are the fucking days where these people would take it upon themselves to protect themselves. No, the onus isn't on them, it's on the rest of us. It makes no fucking sense. It never did. But then again, this has never been about a virus, has it? It's always been about control and the transformation of our society. And that's become so apparent, especially over the course of the last year. But this shit's been irritating me. I'm starting to get in a bizarre habit of noticing patterns a bit too often, and just hearing that over and over and over again in that COVID speech from the other day, scapegoating the vulnerable and telling us we all need to adapt and change our behaviour for the hypothetical vulnerable that we may or may not be in close proximity of. It's just, it is what it is there. But I'll see what she says here before I go. I have to be careful though, because I don't want to obviously play what I say as well, you know what I mean?
Programme is that if all of us have a role to play, and if we all make small sacrifices, for some they're very, very big sacrifices, we will eliminate this virus. And Fabian's question is so important because it gives hope. What's the hope here?
I just kind of got in and around there, so I won't. If you want to watch the video yourself, you can go back and find it, I guess. But it's just unethical to do that, you see. So we all need to live with rules that don't work, and in order to make the vulnerable feel safe. It's ridiculous. It's a sad state of affairs that, irrespective of what's floating about, what pathogens are out there, the vulnerable are always likely to be the targets. You know. But for some strange reason, this time around, the entirety of society has to be turning its head for them. Anyway, as I said, I will either decide to do a stream again. I don't know if I will. Like, I haven't ruled out doing streams again in the future, because it was quite fun for the first wee while, but you know, I don't think that I want to do a stream on that per se, or like a part 2 to that, if you know what I mean, in case it goes on for another 4.5 hours. But it'll either be a stream or a video format at some point, finish off what I started, I know it'll be old news by then because people will have already read it if they wish to read it. My whole intention initially was to kind of do people a solid, just present it all in the one video, go through it like I do in some of my videos myself. Well, that failed, didn't it? So, you know, but it's the thought that counts, folks, and I've just gone half an hour talking about fucking behaviour again. I'm telling you, I'm going mad. I'm going mad with a sore throat, a muffed mouth, and a head that just seems to be bereft of any legitimate attempts to escape the term of fucking behaviour. It's driving me doolally. Anyway, until next time, peace out and all that, like it.